The narrow streets of the small Romanian town buzzed with the sounds of evening life as the group of 6 made their way through the bustling market square. Mia glanced around, taking in the old-world charm of the place. Cobblestone streets, weathered buildings, and the distant silhouette of the Carpathian Mountains painted a picturesque scene, but she couldn't shake the slight unease gnawing at her. Lena, her blonde ponytail bouncing, grinned at Mia as she caught her eye. "Come on, don't look so serious. This is going to be fun." Mia forced a smile and nodded, her fingers absent-mindedly fidgeting with the strap of her backpack. Ahead of them, George, their young professor, was already leading the way, his excitement barely contained. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is where adventure meets history," George said, stopping at the edge of the square to address them. He gestured toward the looming mountains. "The Carpathians are steeped in myth and legend. A place where civilization meets the unknown. But don't worry," he added with a wink, "we'll be sticking to well-worn paths." Alex, ever the adrenaline junkie, elbowed Noah with a grin. "Well-worn? I was hoping for something more exciting." Erin, always the cautious one, rolled her eyes. "I'd settle for safe. I don't want to end up in one of those horror stories we keep hearing about." Local superstitions, George dismissed with a wave. Old tales meant to keep tourists from wandering too far. "We'll be fine." As they made their way toward the trail, an elderly woman, her eyes clouded and hands trembling, suddenly grabbed Mia's arm. Mia flinched, startled by the unexpected touch. "Beware the old village," the woman rasped, her grip surprisingly strong. "Once it claims you, it never lets go." Mia's breath hitched, but before she could say anything, Lena intervened, laughing lightly. "Thank you for the warning, but we'll be careful." The woman's bony fingers slowly released their hold, and Mia watched as the group walked away, George leading the way with confidence. The woman's words echoed in her mind as they left the town behind. The trail opened up to a vast wilderness, where towering trees stretched high into the sky, their branches forming a dense canopy. The smell of pine filled the air, and the crisp mountain breeze cooled their faces as they hiked. The group's mood had lightened considerably, the thrill of exploration taking over. "This is amazing," Lena said, her voice filled with awe. "Look at that view." Ahead, the jagged peaks of the Carpathians stood like sentinels, shrouded in mist. George slowed his pace, turning to address the group once more. "This region has a fascinating history. From ancient Dacian tribes to stories of vampires and ghosts." His voice took on a playful tone as he recounted local legends. "The locals say spirits wander these forests, remnants of villages long forgotten." Mia, walking just behind him, felt a shiver crawl down her spine. She tried to ignore the prickling sensation that settled between her shoulder blades, as though something unseen was watching them from the trees. "Spirits?" Noah scoffed. "Please, I'd rather not become part of the local folklore." Lena laughed, nudging him. "It's all part of the adventure, right?" As they continued deeper into the forest, the signs of the trail became more obscure. The markers, once clear and well-maintained, began to crumble, overtaken by nature's relentless grasp. Mia's unease grew, but she said nothing, determined not to be the killjoy. "Looks like the path hasn't been used in a while," Erin noted, her voice tinged with concern. George waved off her observation. "It's nothing. We're still on track." But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wilderness seemed to press in on them, the trees casting long shadows as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air felt different, thicker, heavier. Despite her unease, she kept quiet, pushing herself to trust George's expertise. By late afternoon, the group reached a fork in the trail. George hesitated for the first time, staring at the diverging paths, his brow furrowed in thought. "Which way?" Alex asked, scanning the dense woods for any signs. George studied the map, turning it over as if the answer would reveal itself. This wasn't on the map. Lena, always eager for more excitement, pointed toward the unmarked path. "Let's go that way. It looks like it leads deeper into the forest." Erin's face paled. "Are you serious? We don't even know where that goes." Mia felt a knot form in her stomach. "I think we should stick to the main trail." But Alex was already supporting Lena. "Come on, Where's your sense of adventure? With the group divided, MIA reluctantly followed as George decided to take the unmarked trail. His confidence, once unshakable, now seemed fragile, but no one wanted to question him further. As they pressed on, the wilderness closed in tighter around them, the trail growing fainter with each step. Night began to fall, and an eerie stillness descended over the forest. The familiar sounds of birds and insects had disappeared, leaving only the soft crunch of their boots against the leaf-covered ground. "We'll camp here," George announced, stopping by a small stream. But the tension among the group was palpable, and as MIA helped set up camp, she couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. As darkness fully settled over the mountains, the group caught sight of something unexpected. Just ahead, nestled in a small valley, was a village ancient and isolated, with stone cottages huddled together as if seeking protection from the wilds. "Is this on the map?" Noah asked, his voice laced with disbelief. George shook his head, intrigued. "No, but it's fascinating." The village seemed untouched by time. No power lines, no sign of modern technology. MIA felt her skin crawl as they entered the settlement. The villagers, though welcoming, exuded a coldness, their smiles too practiced, their eyes too distant. "Please," one of the villagers said, her voice hollow. "Stay with us tonight. The forest is dangerous after dark." MIA glanced at the others. Lena and Alex were eager to accept the hospitality, but Noah and Erin shared her unease. Something about the place felt wrong, but George, fascinated by the village's apparent isolation, accepted the offer without hesitation. As they settled into one of the cottages, the strange behavior of the villagers grew more apparent. They whispered constantly among themselves, casting furtive glances at the group. Their glassy eyes seemed almost inhuman, as though something was missing behind their smiles. Lena awoke suddenly in the dead of night, her senses on high alert. A faint noise outside the window caught her attention, soft, deliberate movements. She shook George awake, and together they peered out into the darkness. There, on the ridge above their camp, stood 4 or 5 figures, their forms barely visible in the faint moonlight. They held flashlights, but made no sound, their faces obscured by shadow. "They're just watching," Lena whispered, her heart racing. George stepped outside, calling out to the figures, but they remained silent, unmoving. The rest of the group joined them, fear tightening in their chests as they watched the figures disappear into the darkness as quietly as they had appeared. Noah, his voice trembling, urged them to leave immediately, but George, ever the rationalist, insisted they wait until daylight. "It's probably just the villagers checking on us," he reasoned, though the unease in his voice betrayed his own doubts. As the first light of dawn crept over the village, the group hastily packed their belongings. But as they prepared to leave, the village elder approached George with a cryptic message. "Stay another night," the elder said, his voice low and steady. "It is not safe to leave." MIA, her nerves already frayed, stepped forward. "We need to go. Now." George hesitated but ultimately agreed. They quickly left the village, but the sense of dread followed them. As they made their way through the wilderness, shadows moved just beyond the edge of their vision, and soft whispers floated through the air. MIA looked back one last time and froze. Standing on the ridge behind them was a lone figure, watching. It was too far away to make out any details, but the figure felt disturbingly familiar. A chill ran down her spine. She knew they weren't alone. The group pushed forward on the foggy, narrow path that led away from the eerie village. The early morning light filtered through the thick mist, casting everything in a cold, grey hue. Mia's breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. They had walked for hours, determined to put as much distance between them and the village as possible, but a sense of dread settled over her as they emerged into a familiar clearing. Lena was the first to stop, her eyes widening as she looked ahead. "Wait, is that?" Mia's heart sank as they all realized where they stood. The village, with its ancient, crumbling cottages, was just ahead of them once again, as if they had never left. "This can't be right," Erin muttered, her voice trembling. "We've been walking in circles," MIA whispered, her hands shaking. "It's like we never left." George, visibly frustrated, studied his map, his fingers running over its worn edges. "That's impossible. We followed the right trail." The compass. It's not the compass, MIA snapped, anger bubbling in her chest. You're not taking this seriously, George. We're stuck here, and it's your fault. George's eyes flickered with frustration, but he remained silent. The group, now shivering in both cold and fear, began murmuring their doubts. Noah, usually quick with a joke, stared at the ground, lips pressed tightly together. We'll figure it out, George finally said, his voice wavering slightly. Let's just rest here and regroup. Before anyone could respond, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the trees, slow, deliberate steps. The group froze, every nerve on edge. Who's there? Noah called, but the forest swallowed his voice. No answer came, just silence. Determined not to stay near the village, they ventured deeper into the forest, their breaths shallow as the towering trees closed in around them. Each step felt like they were wading into something unnatural, as if the forest itself was shifting, alive with a quiet malevolence. We're not alone out here, Erin whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. I can feel it. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. The birds had fallen silent, and even the wind that rustled through the trees earlier had stilled, leaving only an oppressive, stifling quiet. Every rustle of leaves, every cracking branch made them flinch. Mia's skin crawled with a sense of being watched, though whenever she turned to look, nothing was there. Look at this, MIA said, pointing to a tree trunk. Strange markings were carved deep into the bark, swirling patterns that reminded her of the symbols she had seen in the village. George glanced at the markings and waved dismissively. Probably just old trail markers. Ancient symbols, nothing to worry about. But MIA couldn't shake the feeling that the markings were more than that. The tension between them grew as Alex and Lena began to argue. We should go back, Lena said, her voice tight with anxiety. We've been walking for hours, and we're just getting more lost. Alex, always the thrill seeker, scoffed. And do what? Go back to that creepy village? I'd rather die out here. Don't say that, Erin cried, her voice cracking with panic. Don't even joke about that. The argument was cut short by another noise, a rustling from behind them. They turned as one, but again, there was nothing. Still, MIA knew they weren't alone. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon a small clearing in the woods. In the center of the open space stood an ancient stone structure, an altar of sorts, covered in moss and vines. Despite its age, it radiated a cold, eerie power. MIA felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but George insisted they rest. We need to stop, George said, sitting down near the altar. We need to regroup, figure out where we are. Noah, frustrated and fed up with the tension in the group, stood up. I'm going to scout ahead, see if there's a better path. Don't wait up. Noah, don't, MIA called after him, but he was already gone, disappearing into the dense forest. Minutes turned into hours, and as the sun dipped lower, the sky darkening to an ominous grey, Noah still hadn't returned. MIA paced anxiously, her gut telling her that something was very, very wrong. He should have been back by now, she muttered. Something's happened to him. Calm down, MIA, George said, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. He'll be back. But as dusk settled over the clearing, the uneasy silence pressed down on them. The idea of wandering further into the woods to search for Noah was terrifying. They set up camp in the clearing, too afraid to move, but equally afraid to stay. In the flickering light of their campfire, Erin whispered, I saw someone earlier, watching from the trees. Mia's heart skipped a beat. What? Why didn't you say anything? I wasn't sure, Erin said, her voice shaking. But I saw them. They're still out there. MIA tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every snap of a branch, every whisper of the wind sent her nerves into overdrive. She kept thinking of Noah, how he had left and never returned. The forest felt like a living thing, breathing around them, waiting. Then she saw it, a faint, eerie light illuminating the trees at the edge of the clearing. MIA sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. Silhouetted against the faint light were shadowy figures. They stood there, silent and unmoving, watching the camp with an unnatural stillness. MIA quickly shook George awake. Look, she whispered, pointing toward the figures. George blinked sleepily, but when he looked, the figures were gone. He rubbed his eyes and shook his head. "MIA, you're imagining things. There's nothing there." "No, I saw them. They were there," MIA insisted, her voice rising. George sighed, clearly exhausted. "Get some sleep. We'll deal with everything in the morning." But MIA knew what she saw. They were being hunted. At first light, the group was up and searching for Noah. His name echoed through the trees, but there was no response. They combed through the forest until they stumbled upon his backpack, lying near the edge of a ravine. Mia's heart sank as they inspected the scene. Noah's gear was scattered, but there was no sign of him. Panic gripped her chest as they realized that he hadn't simply wandered off, something had taken him. As they searched the area, Lena found something tucked inside Noah's backpack. It was a hand-drawn map, old and faded, with strange symbols marking certain areas. Mia's stomach dropped when she recognized the symbols. They were the same ones from the village, the same ones carved into the trees. "This village," MIA said, pointing at one of the markings on the map. "It's where we stayed. But look, it's marked with the word Turs. What does that mean?" Alex asked, his voice shaking. Mia's voice trembled. "It means erased. The village, it shouldn't exist." Before they could process the full weight of Mia's revelation, Erin let out a blood-curdling scream. The group rushed to her side, only to find Noah's shoes, neatly placed side by side at the edge of the ravine. But Noah was nowhere to be found. As the day waned and the sun began to set once again, the group's fear turned to desperation. MIA clutched the map tightly, convinced they were walking into a trap. George, however, was still clinging to logic, refusing to accept that something supernatural was at play. "We need to keep moving," George said, his voice laced with frustration. "We'll find Noah, and we'll find a way out of here." "No, we won't," MIA whispered, her voice filled with dread. "They're hunting us." As darkness fell, the oppressive silence returned. The same faint whispering from the night before crept closer, surrounding them like a shroud. Suddenly, the figures appeared again, this time, more of them. They stood at the edge of the clearing, watching, their faces obscured by shadow. Lena, her voice trembling, urged the group to run. "We need to go, now." But George stood frozen, his rational mind crumbling as he stared at the figures. For the first time, MIA saw fear in his eyes. The Watchers had found them again, and this time, there was no escaping their gaze. The clearing was filled with a heavy, stifling silence as the group stood frozen in disbelief. Among the shadowy figures standing at the edge of the forest, Noah was there. Mia's heart raced as she squinted through the dim light, trying to make sense of the impossibility before her. His face was emotionless, eyes vacant, as if drained of life. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there like a statue among the Watchers. Lena let out a soft, choked sob, her trembling hand clutching at Mia's arm. How can he be there? We saw his shoes, he's gone." George, pale and stiff, stared in disbelief. He opened his mouth to say something but hesitated, words failing him. Fear flickered behind his eyes. His once firm belief in logic and reason was unraveling before everyone's eyes. MIA, though terrified, took a step forward. "Noah!" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Noah, are you okay?" Noah didn't respond. As MIA moved closer, the Watchers began to fade into the mist, retreating back into the trees with Noah in tow, his body stiff and unnatural, as though dragged by invisible strings. "They took him," MIA whispered. "They took him." George's voice shook with disbelief. "This isn't real. There has to be an explanation." "There is," MIA said, her tone sharp. "We're in danger. We need to leave." Still shaken, George reluctantly agreed, and they decided to head in the opposite direction from where the Watchers had disappeared. They hoped to find a way out before nightfall. With each step they took, the silence of the forest pressed in on them, suffocating their thoughts and deepening their fear. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the group stumbled onto a narrow, treacherous trail that wound down the mountain. The rocks beneath their feet were sharp and uneven, and the drop on either side seemed to plunge into a dark abyss. "We need to move quickly," George muttered, scanning the path ahead. "We can't stay exposed like this for long." Mia's nerves were frayed, every step sending chills through her as the darkness of the forest closed in. She looked behind them, half expecting to see the watchers following silently in their wake. But all she saw were shadows stretching across the rocky landscape. As they hurried down the trail, Erin's foot slipped on a loose rock, sending her tumbling to the ground. She cried out in pain, clutching her ankle as tears filled her eyes. "We have to keep going," Mia urged, but Erin's face was twisted in pain. She couldn't walk. George crouched down beside her, checking her ankle. "It's sprained," he said grimly. "We'll have to move slower." Mia's sense of dread deepened. The slower they moved, the more time they gave the watchers to find them. As they descended further, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, soft at first, but unmistakably there. Rustling sounds echoed through the trees, but when Mia turned to look, nothing was there. "This path," Lena murmured, her voice tinged with fear. "It feels like we've been here before." Mia frowned, her pulse quickening. The path did feel familiar, as though they had walked it already. She shook her head, unwilling to believe that the mountain was somehow trapping them in a loop. "We're just disoriented," George insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's keep moving." Night was fast approaching when they came across the cabin, an old, dilapidated structure hidden deep in the woods. Its windows were shattered, and the wooden planks were rotting, but it was shelter. They had no choice. "We'll stay here tonight," George said, trying to maintain control over the situation. "It's safer than being out in the open." The interior of the cabin was worse than they imagined. Broken furniture littered the floor, and the smell of mold and decay clung to the walls. In the center of the room was an old hearth, its ashes undisturbed for what seemed like years. Among the ashes, charred bones lay scattered. "This place," Mia whispered, staring at the bones. "Something terrible happened here." While George tried to make the cabin somewhat livable, Mia searched through an old drawer near the back. She found a bundle of papers, yellowed with age and covered in cryptic notes. The symbols were similar to those they had seen on the map, the same markings carved into the trees. "These notes," Mia said, flipping through them. "They talk about a curse. The villagers, they made sacrifices to the spirits of the mountain to keep them appeased. It says here that once you enter the pass, you belong to the mountain." George shook his head in disbelief. "It's just local superstition." Mia's hands shook as she read the final line, "There is no leaving." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed outside, slow and deliberate. The watchers had returned. The group huddled together in the corner of the cabin, their breaths shallow, trying to remain as silent as possible. The footsteps drew closer, stopping just outside the door. "They're here," Erin whispered, her voice barely audible, tears streaming down her face. George held a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, but his own hands trembled. Through the cracks in the cabin's walls, Mia could see the faint silhouettes of figures moving outside. They weren't alone. Then, with an agonizing creak, the cabin door slowly swung open. Standing in the doorway was Noah. His eyes were empty, his face pale and emotionless. He took a slow step forward, his movements unnatural, like a puppet on strings. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just raised his arm and pointed, beckoning them to follow. George, desperation in his eyes, stepped forward. "Maybe he's trying to lead us out," he whispered. "Maybe he knows a way." "No," Mia hissed, grabbing George's arm. "That's not Noah anymore. We can't trust him." Before George could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway. Erin let out a piercing scream. It was her sister, Emily, her face just as blank and cold as Noah's. She stood beside him, silently beckoning them to follow. The tension in the cabin was suffocating as the group stood paralyzed by fear. George wavered, torn between his desperate hope that Noah was still alive and Mia's insistent warnings. But Erin was already breaking down. "Emily," Erin sobbed, rushing toward the door. "You're alive. Oh my God, you're alive." She threw herself into her sister's arms, her sobs choking in her throat. But something was wrong. Emily didn't hug her back. Instead, her pale lips twisted into a grotesque smile, too wide, too unnatural. In a swift, horrifying motion, Emily's hand shot up, grabbing Erin by the throat. Mia screamed as Erin's body jerked violently, and Emily dragged her, kicking and gasping, out into the darkness. The door slammed shut, cutting off Erin's desperate, muffled cries. George stood frozen, his face ashen. We have to go after her." But MIA shook her head, her voice hoarse with fear. "No, it's too late. They've taken her." For the first time, George's bravado crumbled completely. He turned to MIA, eyes wide with terror. "What do we do now?" MIA clenched the map in her hand. "We have to find the mountain pass. It's the only way out." With Erin gone and the Watchers still circling outside, MIA, George, and Lena fled into the forest, their footsteps pounding through the underbrush. The darkness was thick and oppressive, the trees closing in around them as if the mountain itself was alive, conspiring to keep them trapped. The whispers followed them, louder now, like voices carried on the wind. MIA glanced over her shoulder and saw shadowy figures moving between the trees, their pale faces just visible in the darkness. They were being hunted. "We need to keep going," MIA urged, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Lena, lagging behind, stumbled and fell to her knees. MIA rushed back to help her, but when she reached out, Lena's body was unnaturally still. Her eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead. MIA shook her, but it was too late. Lena's eyes rolled back into her head, and her body collapsed. The Watchers appeared again, standing over Lena's lifeless body. MIA screamed, pulling George away as the figures moved toward them. "Run," she yelled, and they plunged deeper into the forest, the Watchers closing in. The first light of dawn broke through the thick fog as MIA and George finally reached the foot of the mountain pass. The faint outline of the village they believed would save them could be seen in the distance, beyond the steep, rocky path. For a fleeting moment, MIA allowed herself to hope. They were close, so close to getting out. But the hope was short-lived. Lena stood in the middle of the path ahead, eerily still, a faint smile curving her lips. Her eyes, once so full of life, were now dark and empty. She looked like Lena, but something was wrong, horribly wrong. "Lena!" George called out, his voice breaking. He took a step toward her, but MIA grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "Stop. That's not her," MIA hissed, her pulse racing. "It's like Noah, like Erin's sister. She's not Lena anymore." George looked torn, guilt etched across his face. "But we can't just leave her. We have to. If you get too close," Mia's voice faltered, remembering what happened to Erin. "They're using her." Lena took a step forward, her smile widening in a way that was both unnatural and terrifying. Her voice, sweet and mocking, echoed through the trees. "Come back. You're not supposed to leave. Come back." George hesitated, but MIA pulled him hard, forcing him to run with her. Together, they scrambled up the steep incline, leaving Lena's voice behind, though the sound of her laughter, soft and cold, followed them up the mountain. The rocky path was brutal, and every step seemed to tear at their strength. The steep incline burned their muscles, their legs heavy with exhaustion. The howling wind whipped through the trees, bringing with it a biting cold that cut through their jackets. Mia's breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs screaming with the effort, but she pushed on, pulling George along with her. She could feel the eyes on them, the invisible presence of the Watchers, always lingering, always waiting. George, trailing behind her, stumbled again, his foot catching on a loose rock. He groaned, collapsing onto his knees, gasping for air. His breath was labored, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "I can't keep going," George muttered, his voice breaking under the weight of his despair. "We're dead. There's no getting out of this. We're dead." "Don't say that," MIA snapped, panic rising in her chest. She grabbed his arm, yanking him back to his feet. "We're almost there. We can't stop now." George shook his head, his eyes haunted. "They're going to take us, just like they took Noah. Just like Lena. It's over." MIA glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see the figures of their lost friends, or worse, the Watchers, but the shadows remained empty. Still, she could feel them, lurking just beyond sight. "We keep moving," she said firmly. "No matter what." Despite his protests, MIA dragged George forward, the oppressive silence pressing down on them like a weight. After what felt like hours of climbing, MIA and George reached a narrow ledge where they could stop and catch their breath. The mountain loomed over them, its jagged peaks cutting into the sky like teeth. Below, the forest they had fled from had disappeared, swallowed by the mist and shadows. "We made it," MIA panted, clutching her knees as she tried to calm her racing heart. "We're almost there." But when she pulled out the map to orient herself, a wave of dread washed over her. The map, it had changed. The landmarks she had been relying on were gone. The village that should have been just beyond the pass had vanished from the map altogether. "No, no, no," MIA whispered, her hands shaking. "This can't be right." George peered over her shoulder, panic rising in his voice. "You've been leading us in circles, haven't you? We're right back where we started." "I haven't," Mia's voice cracked with frustration, but deep down, doubt gnawed at her. Were they truly lost? Or was the mountain playing tricks on them? Before she could respond, George froze, staring past her with wide, terrified eyes. MIA followed his gaze, her blood turning to ice. There, on the narrow ledge behind them, stood the Watchers. They were no longer just shadowy figures, they had taken on the forms of Noah, Lena, Erin, and worst of all, George's own reflection. Each of them wore the same blank, soulless expression, their hands beckoning silently for MIA and George to come closer. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the Watchers. Their empty eyes, their motionless forms, it was as though they were waiting for something, waiting for her and George to give in. "George," MIA whispered, backing away slowly. "We have to go." But George was frozen, staring into the face of his doppelganger, his hand trembling. What do you want from us?" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "Why are you doing this?" The Watchers didn't answer. They simply stood there, silent and unmoving. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, George's reflection stepped forward, reaching out a hand toward him. "No," MIA screamed, but it was too late. George reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing against his double's hand. The moment they touched, George gasped, his eyes going wide. His body collapsed to the ground, lifeless, his face frozen in an expression of shock and terror. MIA watched in horror as his soul, whatever part of him had remained, was taken, leaving only an empty shell behind. The Watchers remained still, their gaze fixed on MIA. Mia's legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but she forced herself to keep going. The top of the pass was just ahead. If she could reach the village, maybe, just maybe, she could still escape. When she finally reached the summit, the sight of the village below made her heart leap with hope. It was real. It had to be real. She stumbled down the path toward the village, her legs shaking from exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But as she drew closer, something felt wrong. The village was deathly silent, the streets empty. Not a single person moved. Mia's footsteps echoed in the stillness as she entered the village square. She looked around, expecting to see people, anyone, but there was no one. Just buildings, frozen in time. And then she saw him. Standing in the middle of the square was the elder, the same man who had greeted them when they first arrived in the forgotten village. His sorrowful eyes met hers, and his voice, though soft, carried a weight that chilled her to the bone. "You should never have come here." Mia's mind raced as the elder's words sank in. She stumbled toward him, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. What do you mean?" she gasped. "We just wanted to leave, to get home." The elder sighed, his expression filled with sorrow. "The village you saw was erased long ago. Its people were wiped out for their sins, for the dark rituals they practiced to appease the spirits of the mountain. But when they died, the spirits took their place, creating this trap." MIA shook her head in disbelief. "No. That's impossible. The village was real. You're real." The elder's face began to shift, his features warping and twisting. His sorrowful eyes turned blank, his skin paling as his body transformed into that of Noah. The realization hit MIA like a punch to the chest. "They're not real," MIA whispered, her voice trembling. "None of this is real." The elder, Noah, smiled, his face eerily calm. "You accepted their hospitality. You sealed your fate the moment you stayed in the village. Now, like them, you are part of the mountain." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Mia's heart sank. She had been walking in circles the entire time. The village, this place, it was a trap, created by the spirits to lure in lost souls like hers. She fell to her knees in the village square, surrounded by the silent, smiling villagers. Their faces twisted into expressions of cold amusement as they watched her, waiting for her to break. "Please," Mia whispered, her voice weak. "Let me go." But the villagers said nothing. They only smiled, their empty eyes reflecting the dimming light. As they closed in around her, Mia's vision began to blur, the world fading into darkness. The last thing she saw was Noah's face, leaning close to her, whispering in her ear, "Welcome home."